In 1868, 41 soldiers marched into the woods to build a camp. Only 14 ever came back. The rest were lost to something history still refuses to explain. Was it madness, starvation, or a curse older than the trees themselves? Tonight, we uncover what happened inside that forgotten encampment. Stay with us, subscribe, and ring the bell, because once you hear their story, you'll never step into the woods the same way again. In the year 1868, America was still patching its wounds. The Civil War had ended only 3 years earlier, yet the land remained restless. Veterans roamed the countryside, some looking for honest work, others carrying scars too deep to ever heal. Many of them carried rifles, not because they expected battle, but because they had nothing else left to hold on to. These men were used to hardship, yet even they knew there were places on the map that ought to be left alone. One of those places was a stretch of wilderness so dense and unwelcoming that locals gave it names not found on any official survey. Some called it the Hollow of No Return. Others whispered of God's blind spot. Farmers at the edge of town warned travelers against going too deep, claiming that the woods did not forgive trespassers. Hunters avoided it entirely. Even wild animals skirted its border, as though sensing something human eyes could not. The forest seemed older than the hills around it, its trees twisted in unnatural shapes, roots clawing out of the soil like fingers reaching for light. At certain times of day, the mist refused to lift, hugging the earth in a way that made the landscape look more like a dream or a graveyard than a piece of living land. In the mornings, the canopy swallowed the sun, turning daylight into a gray shadow. At night, the silence pressed down so hard that even the call of an owl sounded like a scream. Folklore clung to the place like the moss on its trees. Generations before, it was said that entire hunting parties had entered those woods and never come out. A group of settlers traveling west in the 1830s was said to have vanished there, leaving behind wagons found years later, empty and rotted, with no sign of human remains. Local native tribes avoided the area altogether, passing down warnings in hushed tones. One elder described it simply: "That is the land where spirits feed." For the superstitious, the meaning was clear. For the practical, it was still a place best left alone. Travelers spoke of hearing drums that had no source, faint at first, then louder the deeper they walked. Others told of seeing shapes between the trees, shapes that vanished when the eye tried to focus. And yet, with every story, there was always someone willing to dismiss it all as fancy. That is why the arrival of a small detachment of soldiers, 41 in all, was met with unease by locals in the nearest town. The men had been ordered to establish a temporary encampment within the forest, to secure a route thought to be valuable for trade and scouting. To their commanding officer, the assignment was straightforward: march in, set up camp, report back. He had little patience for campfire stories. To him, fear of the woods was nothing more than ignorance dressed up as legend, but the locals did not see it that way. They watched the soldiers pass through the streets with a mixture of pity and dread, as if they were witnessing a funeral procession before the coffin had even been nailed shut. Shopkeepers whispered to one another, "They'll be lucky if half of them return." Children dared each other to follow the soldiers to the edge of the trees, only to turn back the moment the canopy swallowed them from view. One farmer muttered under his breath, "Marching into the hollow is like marching into the grave." The soldiers themselves, hardened though they were, could not help but feel the weight of the place as they drew near. The air grew colder, the light dimmer. Even the horses balked at the forest's edge, refusing to move forward until beaten into obedience. Some men laughed nervously, calling the locals cowards. Others gripped their rifles tighter, pretending not to hear the stillness that seemed to press against their ears. The captain barked orders, reminding them of duty. "This is nothing but trees," he declared. "You fought at Shiloh, at Antietam, At Gettysburg. You think you cannot march through a patch of woods? His words carried authority, but even he could not shake the sight of trees twisted into spirals, branches bending like they were trying to block the path. Inside, the forest grew stranger still. Trails disappeared within minutes, swallowed by undergrowth. Streams ran in circles, leading men back to where they started. The deeper they marched, the more the silence thickened, as if the very air had been drained of life. No birds sang. No squirrels darted across branches. Even the wind seemed afraid to move Dot by the time the soldiers reached a clearing wide enough to pitch their tents. Some had already begun to whisper among themselves. The chaplain crossed himself repeatedly, murmuring prayers under his breath. A veteran leaned close to a younger recruit and muttered, "This place ain't right. We shouldn't be here." The recruit laughed it off. Though the sound came out thin and strained, the encampment was established, but unease settled with it. The trees pressed in from all sides, looming like watchmen with secrets to guard. A fire was lit, though its glow seemed weaker than it should have been, as if the flames themselves feared the dark. When night came, it came fast, drowning the camp in blackness that felt absolute. Men lay in their tents listening, straining, waiting, and that was when the first sound came. A rhythm faint, low, like the distant beat of a drum. Slow, patient, unstoppable. The kind of sound that made the skin crawl and the heart quicken, even if no one could say for sure whether it was real. The 41 soldiers who stepped into the forest in 1868 were not all the same. On paper, they were one unit, bound by orders and discipline. In truth, they were a fractured band of men, each carrying his own scars, ambitions, and fears. Some had fought through the blood-soaked fields of the Civil War, hardened by years of cannon fire and death. Others were barely more than boys, wearing uniforms that still smelled of fresh cloth, eager to prove their worth in the shadow of veterans. At their head was Captain Elias Harrow, a man in his early 40s, whose eyes bore the weight of defeats he would never admit. He had led men before sometimes to victory, often to graves. His promotion had been questioned by peers, whispered about by rivals, but this assignment offered him a chance at redemption. Harrow believed that discipline could conquer fear, and that duty would carry them through the forest as it had through battle. Yet even he, as he studied the gnarled trees ahead, felt the faint tug of unease. Beside him marched Lieutenant Nathaniel Crow, younger, ambitious, and dangerous in his hunger for recognition. Where Harrow carried the caution of a man who had seen too much, Crow burned with the fire of one who believed himself destined for greatness. He craved victories to carve his name into history books. To him, the encampment was not a cursed venture, but a stepping stone. Crow often spoke of his future with certainty: land, political office, perhaps even a general's star. His confidence drew some men to him, but others muttered that ambition like his often ended in disaster. Then there was Chaplain Samuel Vance, whose role was not to command, but to guide the souls of the men. Vance was thin, pale, with eyes that looked older than his years. He carried no weapon, only a Bible, a small wooden cross, and a voice that wavered between hope and despair. He had seen enough of war's carnage to doubt whether God truly walked among them anymore, yet he clung to his faith with a trembling grip. To some soldiers, his presence was comforting. To others, it was a constant reminder of mortality. Among the ranks were veterans who had known nothing but soldiering for most of their adult lives. Corporal Harlan Briggs was one such man, a grizzled figure with a face lined like the bark of an old tree. He had fought in more battles than he could count, burying friends along the way. Briggs said little, but when he did speak, younger men listened. He carried a pocket-knife that had belonged to his brother, killed at Antietam, and he often thumbed its handle absent-mindedly, as though drawing strength from it. In contrast, the younger recruits were filled with bravado. Private William Dorsey, only 19, boasted loudly that the stories of haunted woods were for children and cowards. He laughed at locals who warned them, swore that no tree or shadow could scare a soldier. Yet at night, when the forest pressed close, Dorsey was often the first to sit nearest the fire, his hand never far from his rifle. His arrogance masked a boy's fear, though he would never admit it aloud that others carried secrets and sorrows. Sergeant Matthew Cole wrote letters to his sister in Ohio, though he never mailed them. His pack held dozens, neatly folded, confessions and reassurances that would never reach her. He had promised to return home, yet something in his eyes suggested he doubted he ever would. Private Edgar Miles, quiet and withdrawn, carried a locket with a miniature portrait of a wife who had died during the war. He rarely spoke, but his hand brushed the locket constantly, as though to anchor himself against the emptiness of the forest. The soldiers formed cliques within the unit. The veterans stuck together, their conversations steeped in old battles and scars. The recruits clustered nervously, joking too loudly, trying to convince themselves they were unafraid. Between them stood the officers, strained by pride and ambition. And threading through all of it was the chaplain, drifting from man to man, listening, praying, warning of dangers they could not yet see as they marched deeper into the woods. Small details revealed the cracks within the company. A recruit muttered that the forest smelled wrong, like damp stone instead of earth. A veteran swore he heard footsteps behind them, though no one was there. The captain silenced them, demanding focus, but the murmurs continued in hushed tones. Even the jokes grew fewer, replaced by uneasy glances into the trees. Still, there was camaraderie. In the evenings, before the true strangeness began, the men shared what rations they had, swapping stories of farms and towns left behind. Dorsey strummed a battered banjo, its strings dull but its tune familiar, and for a moment the campfire warmth pushed the darkness back. Laughter rose, brief and fragile, clinging to the night like a candle flame against the wind. But even during these lighter moments, some men could not shake the feeling of being watched. Corporal Briggs kept his back to the fire, facing the trees. Sergeant Cole paused often in his writing, glancing into the shadows. Chaplain Vance prayed more frequently, whispering verses until his voice cracked. It was in these first days, before the horrors took shape, that the true measure of the soldiers began to show. They were not merely a number 41 strong. They were fathers, brothers, sons, dreamers, liars, sinners, and believers. Each carried hopes and burdens into the forest. And as the days passed, those very traits, their pride, their ambition, their doubt, would decide who vanished into the shadows and who would stagger out alive. The Cursed Encampment was no faceless tragedy. It was the unraveling of 41 distinct lives, stitched together by duty and undone by the woods that would not let them go. The first days in the clearing seemed ordinary enough, at least on the surface. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, pitching tents, digging trenches, and stacking supplies. Orders barked by Captain Harrow carried across the camp, steady and firm, reassuring men that routine would keep fear at bay. To many, it felt like any other deployment. Yet beneath that thin layer of order, something unnatural already stirred. On the very first night, the fire refused to behave. The men piled wood high, but the flames burned low, as if suffocated by an unseen hand. Sparks sputtered, smoke rose in thick coils, and the glow barely pushed back the darkness. Men muttered curses, blaming damp wood, but Briggs swore the logs were dry when he cut them. By morning, the ashes were cold, though they should have smoldered until dawn. Our strangers still were the provisions. Salt pork that had been packed tightly in barrels turned rancid after only 2 days. Hardtack crumbled into powder as though it had aged a year overnight. The lieutenant accused the supply sergeant of negligence, but the sergeant insisted the food had been inspected before departure. "Something in this place spoils it," he muttered, though no one wanted to hear such words aloud. Then came the first disappearance. Private Dorsey, the brash young recruit who had mocked local legends, had drawn the midnight watch. He was last seen pacing near the perimeter, rifle on his shoulder, whistling to keep his courage. At dawn, when the change of guard arrived, Dorsey was gone. His rifle lay on the ground. His tracks led a short distance into the trees and then stopped, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The captain ordered a search, fanning out in squads, calling Dorsey's name until their voices cracked. But no answer came. No broken branches, no torn cloth, no sign of struggle. It was as though he had walked into the mist and simply ceased to exist. The captain declared him a deserter, but even his voice lacked conviction. Men whispered that the forest had claimed its first soul. That night, unease thickened. Some claimed to hear faint drumming far in the distance, a steady rhythm that rose and fell like a heartbeat. Others heard voices, whispers, that seemed to come from behind them, though no one was there when they turned. The chaplain clutched his cross and muttered prayers until his lips bled. A few men laughed nervously, calling it tricks of the wind, but none slept soundly. On the third day, more signs appeared. One tent collapsed, though its stakes had not been touched. The captain's compass spun wildly, its needle jerking like a dying insect. A trail they had cut the day before seemed to vanish overnight, swallowed by undergrowth. The forest shifted, closing in, as though erasing the mark of their presence. The soldiers grew irritable, snapping at each other over small things, who ate more, who shirked duty, who failed to keep the fire burning. Harrow enforced order with threats of lashes, but discipline did little to calm their nerves. Each man felt eyes upon him, watching from between the trees. And sometimes, in the corner of their vision, they swore they saw shapes, figures standing still, vanishing when faced directly. It was Corporal Briggs who first found the carvings. He had gone to fetch water and returned pale, clutching a piece of bark. "Symbols," he said. Etched deep into tree trunks were patterns no one recognized, spirals, jagged lines, shapes that seemed to twist if stared at too long. Some thought them tribal markings, though no tribes claimed the area. Others swore they resembled letters from a language never meant for men to read. The chaplain insisted it was a warning. The lieutenant scoffed, calling it superstition, though his hand trembled as he dismissed it. The captain ordered the trees cut down, but when axes struck the marked wood, the sound echoed unnaturally, louder than steel on oak should ever be. A private dropped his axe and refused to touch it again, muttering about curses. By the end of the week, fear had rooted itself as firmly as the trees. Men jumped at shadows, rifles half raised at every rustle. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of being hunted, of footsteps pacing just beyond the tents. Each morning, men awoke feeling watched, their bodies sore as though pressed down during the night. One morning, Sergeant Cole discovered handprints in the mud outside his tent. Too small for a soldier's, too deep for a child's. The chaplain grew more insistent, warning that they had trespassed on sacred ground. His prayers became louder, frantic, until some accused him of spreading fear. "Better to be afraid," he shot back, "than to pretend there is nothing here." Others, desperate to keep order, avoided his words. Yet none could ignore the unease gnawing at their stomachs. Then another soldier vanished. Private Miles, the quiet man with the locket, was gone at dawn. His bedroll was neatly folded. His boots remained by the fire. No one had heard him leave, yet he was simply no longer there. The locket was found in the dirt, its chain snapped. Men looked to the captain for answers, but Harrow had none. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened, and he barked orders with a fury born of desperation. The disappearances, the whispers, the failing supplies, each cut into the soldiers' resolve. Where once they had marched with confidence, now they shuffled nervously, rifles clutched, eyes darting. Jokes ceased. Songs died. Even the banjo strings snapped, left untuned in the corner of the camp. Silence became their constant companion, broken only by the pulse of distant drums that no one admitted hearing. It was not yet panic. That would come later. But the seeds had been planted. Men who once trusted one another now eyed their comrades with suspicion. Some whispered that deserters were sneaking off in the night. Others claimed missing had been taken by something walking between the trees. Whatever the truth, one fact could not be ignored. The encampment was changing. It was no longer a place of shelter, but of dread. The forest had begun to close its grip, and the soldiers knew, though they dared not speak it aloud, that their numbers would only continue to shrink. By the second week, the soldiers were no longer one company, but two factions divided by fear. Discipline frayed like old rope, and no order from Captain Harrow could mend it. Half the men believed in duty, clinging desperately to military structure, insisting that they must hold the camp until orders said otherwise. They followed Harrow, though even he seemed shaken, his voice rasping from lack of sleep, his once steady hands trembling as he gripped his saber. These men repeated their drills by day and kept the fires lit by night, determined to pretend that nothing was amiss. The other half whispered of retreat. Lieutenant Crow gave their doubts a voice. His ambition turned sharp with anger. "We are not here to die for trees and shadows," he barked one evening, pacing before his supporters. "We have no reinforcements, no supplies, no communication. If we remain, we vanish one by one. Better to march out alive than rot like fools." His words stirred the recruits especially, boys who no longer laughed by the fire, but trembled at every rustle in the dark. The chaplain stood between the factions, his prayers growing louder with each night. He warned that the forest was cursed, that no compass or discipline would save them from what dwelt among the trees. "It is not a question of duty or desertion," Vance pleaded. "It is a question of survival of the soul. Leave this place, or it will take you whole." Some wept at his words. Others accused him of madness. The breaking point came with the storm. On the 12th night, black clouds rolled over the canopy without warning. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of iron and rain. Lightning split the sky in jagged scars, throwing the clearing into violent flashes of white. The wind roared, bending trees as though trying to rip them from the earth. Tents collapsed. Fires died in a hiss of steam. The storm swallowed every voice, every cry, until the men were reduced to shadows darting between shadows. It was in that chaos that 5 men vanished. Their screams were heard high, sharp, swallowed quickly by the thunder. Some claimed to see shapes dragging them into the trees. Others swore the ground opened beneath their boots. When dawn came, there were no bodies, no weapons, no trace beyond a few torn straps and scattered buttons glinting in the mud. Panic broke the camp. Soldiers shouted at one another, rifles half raised, accusations spilling like floodwater. Some cried that deserters had fled, abandoning their brothers. Others swore they had seen hands pale, too thin, reaching out of the storm to clutch the missing. A few insisted it was all hallucination, madness spreading like disease. But none could explain the fact that 5 armed men had disappeared. In the span of a heartbeat, Captain Harrow tried to restore order. He slammed his saber against a crate, his voice cracking as he bellowed, "Enough! We are soldiers, not frightened children." His words rang hollow. His uniform was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes bloodshot. He looked less like a leader and more like a desperate man clinging to command. Crow seized the moment. "Look at him," the lieutenant shouted, pointing at the captain. "Does this look like a man who will lead you home?" No, he will march us to our graves. The forest is taking us, and still he says, stay the course. Stay, and you die. Leave, and you live. Choose. Voices rose on both sides, angry, terrified. Some soldiers shoved each other, fists raised. A rifle discharged into the storm, the shot lost in the thunder. For a heartbeat, all froze, staring at the smoke curling from the barrel. Then chaos erupted. Men brawled in the mud, grappling, shouting, knives drawn. Brothers in arms became enemies. A soldier's skull cracked against a stone, his body left twitching in the rain. Another was stabbed in the thigh, blood running bright against the gray earth. The storm howled above, but within the clearing, another storm raged, one born of fear, hunger, and the sense that death circled them like a predator. When the violence finally ebbed, the company was broken. 2 men lay dead by their brothers' hands. 5 more were gone to the forest. Nearly half the unit now followed Crow, demanding they abandon the encampment before all were lost. The rest clung stubbornly to Harrow, unwilling to admit defeat, but too shaken to speak with confidence. And then came the carvings. At first light, Briggs returned from a perimeter check, his face ashen. The symbols, he said, voice shaking. They've multiplied. The men followed him to the edge of the clearing. Dozens of trees bore fresh markings, spirals, crosses, jagged lines. Some dripped with sap as though carved in the night. No human hands had been seen, yet the forest now stood marked like a vast altar. The air stank of resin and iron, heavy enough to choke. The chaplain fell to his knees. "We are trespassers," he sobbed. "We were warned." The captain ordered axes brought, determined to destroy the trees, to prove his command still meant something. But when the blade struck, the sound reverberated wrong too loud, like metal striking hollow stone. The vibrations rattled teeth, sent shudders down spines. One axe shattered on impact, the blade snapping clean from its haft. The soldier who wielded it dropped to his knees, screaming that the forest had cursed him. He had to be dragged away as he clawed at his own face. That night, the drums grew louder. No one spoke of it, but every man heard. A rhythm that pulsed not only through the air, but through their very bones, as though the earth itself beat with it. Slow, patient, unyielding. It followed them into sleep, into dreams, into the thin hours where silence should have been deepest. Sleep became impossible. Men lay with eyes wide open, staring at the dark canvas of their tents, certain that something moved outside. Some swore they saw figures crouching just beyond the firelight, figures, too tall, too thin, watching. One recruit woke screaming, insisting that a hand had reached into his tent. When torches were brought, there was nothing but claw-like impressions in the dirt, where he swore the fingers had been dot by the 14th day. The encampment was no longer a military post. It was a cage. The men were prisoners not of the forest, but of their fear and distrust. Each disappearance, each strange sign, had chipped away at their unity until only fragments remained. The captain still spoke of duty. Crow still cried for retreat. The chaplain prayed until his voice bled raw. But beneath their words, the truth was clear. The forest had begun to unmake them, and though they did not yet know it, the worst was still to come. The storm passed, but it left behind more than wreckage. It left a company of men broken in spirit, starved and desperate. By the 15th day, the clearing looked less like an encampment and more like the ruin of one. Tents sagged, fires burned low, and supplies had dwindled to scraps. Salt pork was gone, hardtack spoiled, and even the water in barrels carried a foul taste, as though the forest itself had seeped into it. Hunger gnawed at the men's bellies, sharpening tempers into weapons. Arguments broke out over crumbs. Fists swung over rations. A soldier was caught hoarding a strip of dried meat, and 3 men beat him until his jaw broke. Harrow tried to punish them, but when he barked the order, none obeyed. His authority, once unchallenged, now stood on legs of rotting wood. The drums did not stop. At night they grew louder, echoing through the soil, through the bones of every man. Some tried to plug their ears, but the rhythm pulsed within, impossible to silence. Worse still were the voices' whispers that slithered into tents like smoke. Some men claimed they heard wives, others mothers, calling their names. A few swore the voices offered bargains. Step into the trees, and you'll be free. Several followed those calls and never returned. Sleep became a battlefield. Men dreamed of shadows pacing beside them, of faces leaning down in the dark. Sergeant Cole woke screaming that something had been pressing on his chest. His tent mates swore they saw his body rise inches off the ground, as if held by invisible hands, before he fell gasping back onto his cot. By morning, his hair had gone stark white. The chaplain grew frantic. He wandered the camp clutching his cross, preaching louder and wilder. "We have trespassed," he cried. "This land does not belong to us. It belongs to the dead." Some fell to their knees, begging him to pray louder. Others hissed that he was feeding their fear, that his words themselves carried the curse. Once, a soldier struck him across the face. He did not strike, back only bled quietly, whispering prayers through broken lips. The mutiny arrived like a spark in dry grass. Lieutenant Crow had gathered a loyal following, men too frightened to stay, too bitter to keep discipline. One night, by the dim glow of a struggling fire, he confronted Harrow outright. "You are leading us to slaughter," he spat, his voice sharp with hunger and fury. "Every day we bury fewer men, and every night the forest takes more. You cling to orders written by men who are not here, who do not hear the drums, who do not see the shadows. I will not die for your pride." Harrow drew his saber. "You will obey?" he hissed. But his voice cracked, and his hand trembled. Crow raised his rifle. Around them, soldiers shouted, some for Harrow, some for Crow, some only to silence the madness. A shot rang, then another. The clearing erupted. Brothers turned on brothers. Rifles fired into the night. Bayonets clashed in the mud. Fists smashed against skulls. Knives slashed through flesh. Fire spread from an overturned lantern, licking through the supply tent, devouring what little food remained. Sparks leapt to canvas, and in minutes the encampment burned. Men stumbled through smoke, choking, blinded, fighting shapes they could not distinguish as friend or foe. Some fled into the trees, screaming, rifles clutched in desperation. Others collapsed beside the flames, consumed by exhaustion and terror. When dawn finally bled across the forest, the clearing was a graveyard. The fire had eaten half the camp, reducing supplies to ash. 3 bodies lay crumpled in the mud, shot through the chest, their faces still twisted in rage. Another was found with his throat cut, his blood soaking the roots of a tree, etched with symbols. The survivors staggered among the ruins, hollow-eyed, soot-stained, gaunt with hunger. Harrow's saber was gone, lost in the melee. His voice was hoarse, reduced to whispers that no longer commanded respect. Crow, too, had lost his fire, his followers scattered, his own eyes bloodshot and wild. The chaplain knelt in the ashes, rocking back and forth, muttering prayers no one dared interrupt. From that night onward, the company was no longer an army. It was a handful of men clinging to instinct, stripped of discipline, stripped of faith in orders, stripped of anything but survival. Hallucinations spread like sickness. Soldiers swore they saw comrades long dead walking among them. Some saluted fallen officers from past battles, weeping openly as they reached for ghosts. One recruit held long conversations with a man no one else could see, laughing and nodding until he wandered into the trees and vanished. Another carved strange symbols into his own arms, insisting they would protect him. He bled out by morning, got the boundary between dream and waking blurred. At night, men swore the forest crept closer, trees shifting nearer, branches leaning down as if to listen. By day, they discovered new markings on trunks' faces, crude and distorted, staring at the camp. The earth itself seemed hostile, mud sucking at their boots, roots tripping their steps. Food was gone. Hunger drove men to chew leather straps, to boil weeds, to fight over scraps of charred grain from the fire. Some whispered of darker thoughts, of flesh that might sustain them. One recruit swore he saw a comrade gnawing on something pale in the shadows. When challenged, the man fled into the woods, screaming. He never returned. Trust evaporated. Every rustle in the dark, every missing man, sparked accusations. Murder, theft, betrayal, the words hissed through the ranks like venom. Men clutched rifles not just against the forest, but against each other. No one slept deeply. No one ate enough to quell the gnawing in their bellies. By the 17th day, the clearing was only a memory. The fire-scorched ruins were abandoned. The survivors, now fewer than 25, marched into the woods again, driven not by orders, but by desperation. Their camp was ash, their command broken, their unity destroyed. They stumbled beneath twisted branches, gaunt and half-mad, carrying rifles that felt heavier with each step. Captain Harrow shuffled among them, his eyes hollow, his once proud shoulders bent. Lieutenant Crow strode ahead, but the fire of ambition in him had dimmed into something desperate, something feral. The chaplain lagged behind, clutching his cross, muttering prayers through cracked lips, his face sunken as though he carried all 41 souls on his back. The forest did not relent. The drums followed. The whispers grew louder. And the men, fewer with each passing night, began to understand a truth too dreadful to speak. They were not marching to safety. They were marching into the heart of something that wanted them gone. By the 19th day, the company no longer resembled soldiers. They were scarecrows in torn uniforms, hollow-eyed, staggering through a forest that refused to release them. Boots hung in tatters, rifles dragged in the mud, cheeks sunken against sharp bones. Hunger had stripped them to shadows of men, and fear had stripped them further still. Of the 41 who had marched in, fewer than 20 remained. Their numbers dwindled with each night. Some slipped away quietly, walking into the trees without a word, as if following invisible calls. Others collapsed from exhaustion and never rose again. Those who tried to carry the fallen soon abandoned them, driven by the cruel logic that carrying the dead would only create more graves. Survival became an act of selfishness. The forest itself seemed to twist against them. Paths wound back on themselves. Streams that should have led outward circled to the same clearing. Men swore they saw familiar trees again and again, carved with the same mocking symbols. It was as if they were marching inside a cage with no door. The hallucinations grew worse. One night, a recruit shouted in joy, pointing into the darkness. "My brother!" he cried, running forward with arms outstretched. His comrades lunged to stop him, but he vanished into the trees before they could reach him. Only silence answered their calls. Later, they found his hat on the forest floor, torn and stained. Another soldier claimed to hear church bells in the distance. He wept, insisting they were close to a town. When pressed, he admitted the bells rang with the same rhythm as the drums that haunted their nights. By morning, he too was gone. The chaplain grew quieter. His prayers turned into mutters, his cross worn smooth from the constant grip of trembling fingers. Once he collapsed to his knees, whispering, "The forest wants us in pieces. It feeds on our weakness." The others dragged him to his feet, but his words lingered like a sickness. Captain Harrow no longer barked orders. His saber was gone, lost in the chaos, and his voice carried no command. He shuffled like the rest, eyes sunken, lips moving with words no one heard. Some swore he was speaking to someone only he could see. Others claimed he walked with an invisible companion at his side. Lieutenant Crow pressed forward still, but ambition had curdled into obsession. "We will get out," he muttered, again and again. "We will get out. I will not vanish here." His men followed not out of loyalty, but because moving behind him felt easier than deciding where to step themselves at last. After days that blurred together, their numbers thinned to 14. 14 gaunt survivors stumbling through branches that tore at their clothes, shadows that seemed to reach for their throats. When the trees finally thinned, they scarcely believed it. The canopy broke, sunlight struck their faces, and beyond the tree line lay open fields. They staggered into the nearest town like ghosts. The townsfolk recoiled at the sight uniforms shredded, skin stretched tight across bones, eyes wide and hollow. The survivors stank of smoke, rot, and fear. Some dropped to their knees, kissing the dirt road as if it were holy ground. Others simply collapsed, too weak to stand when questioned. Their answers offered no clarity. One muttered of drums that never stopped. Another spoke of hands reaching from the ground. A third whispered that the forest itself had swallowed the others whole. Each man's account contradicted the next, weaving a tapestry of madness that no outsider could believe. Rumors spread swiftly. Some said the men had turned on each other, slaughtering comrades for food. Others claimed deserters had abandoned the weak, leaving them to die. The chaplain's testimony that they had trespassed on cursed ground was dismissed as hysteria. Yet even skeptics could not deny the terror etched into the faces of the 14. The survivors themselves found no peace. They slept little, waking from nightmares that bled into waking hours. A few swore they still heard the drums, faint beneath the silence of civilized streets. One was found wandering the outskirts at night, staring into the tree line, muttering, "They're still waiting." Another died screaming in his sleep, his body twisted as though held down by invisible hands. The captain lasted only weeks. His mind unraveled, his speech reduced to murmurs of eyes in the trees, voices in the dark. He died in his cot, eyes wide, mouth open as if gasping for orders he would never give again. Lieutenant Crow fared little better, drinking himself into stupors, shouting of betrayal and glory lost. He disappeared one night, leaving only his boots by the riverbank. The chaplain lived longest, but carried his torment until the end. In his final days, he was said to whisper constantly, "We were never meant to leave." 14 walked out, but 14 were only borrowed. And so the legacy of the Cursed Encampment grew. 14 survivors bore witness, yet their stories only deepened the mystery. No one agreed on what truly happened in the forest. No one could explain why the woods consumed 27 and spared 14, but all agreed on one thing. The men who walked out were never the same. 41 soldiers marched into the forest in 1868. 14 returned. The others left no graves, no bodies, no answers, only silence and shadows that stretched across generations. Historians argue still. Some insist the men went mad from hunger, isolation, and fear, turning on each other until only a handful remained. Others suggest deserters fled into the wilderness, abandoning their brothers to fate. A few whisper that the survivors invented the curse to hide unspeakable crimes, yet the accounts of the 14 remain, fractured but persistent. Each man described drums in the night, voices that lured comrades away, symbols etched into trees by hands unseen. Were these delusions born of exhaustion or fragments of something darker, something the forest does not allow us to name? To this day, the stretch of woods where the encampment stood is avoided. Locals call it the soldier's grave. Travelers who stray too far report sudden silences, the feeling of eyes on their backs, and the faint echo of boots marching in unison, though no column can be seen. Perhaps the forest claimed those 27 men as payment for trespass. Perhaps the 14 who returned were not spared, but simply sent back to carry the curse outward. Either way, the story remains a wound in history half remembered, half believed, yet impossible to forget. And so I leave you with a question. If you walked into those woods today, would you hear the drums? Would you feel the eyes? Or would you, too, vanish into the silence? If this story unsettled you, don't walk away just yet. Like, share, and subscribe, because there are more forgotten horrors still waiting to be told.